What if the secret to living your best life is to stop trying? Not trying harder, not setting more goals, not building a vision board or reading 5 more books or hacking your habits. Just stop trying, stop pretending, stop playing the game, stop chasing what everyone else says will make you happy. Because maybe the problem isn't that you're not doing enough. Maybe the problem is that you've been doing too much of the wrong thing. And no one knew that better than Diogenes, the ancient philosopher who didn't just walk away from society's expectations. He spat on them, laughed at them, and then pissed on them, literally and figuratively. Diogenes of Sinope wasn't your average philosopher. He didn't write elegant essays. He didn't build schools. He didn't sit in a marble lecture hall debating fine points of logic. He lived in a barrel, ate food from trash heaps, begged for scraps, and walked around the streets of Athens with a lantern in broad daylight, claiming he was looking for an honest man. He once saw a child drinking from a stream with his hands and immediately threw away his own cup, realizing he didn't need it. He crashed Plato's lectures to mock him. And when Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the world, offered him anything he desired, Diogenes simply replied, "Yes, move, you're blocking the sun." This wasn't just performance art. This was philosophy in motion. Diogenes believed that most of our suffering comes not from what we lack, but from what we cling to. Status, approval, appearance, possessions, comfort. We build lives that look successful from the outside but feel empty on the inside. We chase the idea of happiness, constantly upgrading our routines, habits, devices, and identities, only to end up more anxious, more burned out, and more disconnected. Self-help today is often just self-optimization in disguise, a way of polishing the mask instead of taking it off. But Diogenes had a different idea, a radical one. What if the key to peace isn't addition, but subtraction? Cynicism, at least in its original philosophical form, is not about being negative. It's about cutting through the bullshit. Diogenes wasn't cynical because he hated people. He was cynical because he saw how deeply people had lost themselves in lies, the lie of needing to impress others, the lie of needing more to feel worthy, the lie of needing to fit in, to be safe. And so he stripped his life bare, not just physically but mentally, emotionally, spiritually. He chose a life of extreme simplicity not as a gimmick but as a direct path to freedom. He wanted nothing from anyone, and in that nothingness he found power. Modern culture teaches us to chase our best self. Be more productive, be more attractive, be more successful. But Diogenes asks, what if your best self isn't something you build, but something you uncover once you stop pretending? What if the point isn't to be better, but to be real? That's what this video is about. Not the 5 steps to productivity, not the latest stoic morning routine, but something deeper and more dangerous. The ancient art of not giving a damn about the wrong things. The path of subtraction. The savage, freeing, uncomfortable philosophy of living with less, but living more honestly. This is the Cynic's Guide to Living Your Best Life, and it all starts by asking, what are you willing to let go of? Because maybe, just maybe, that's the first step to being free. To understand Diogenes, we have to begin by stepping into a world very different from ours, yet eerily familiar. Ancient Athens, around the 4th century BCE, was a city at the height of its philosophical brilliance but also at the crossroads of cultural decay. Socrates had recently shaken the foundation of Athenian values by challenging everything from justice to virtue, only to be sentenced to death for corrupting the youth. In the wake of his trial, His legacy sparked new philosophical movements, each trying to answer the same question in different ways. What does it mean to live a good life? Plato sought to build an ideal world through reason. Aristotle leaned toward balance and moderation. But there was another school forming, led by Socrates' student Antisthenes, which took a more radical stance. Antisthenes believed that virtue wasn't about knowledge or theory, it was about action. And into this world of debate and upheaval walked a wild, uncompromising figure, Diogenes of Sinope. Diogenes wasn't born in Athens. He came from Sinope, a city on the coast of the Black Sea where he worked of all things as a banker. But something went wrong. According to legend, either Diogenes or his father was caught defacing currency, literally taking coins and altering their images, rendering them unusable. In ancient Greece, currency wasn't just money, it was a symbol of civic trust, of shared value. By corrupting it, Diogenes wasn't just committing fraud, he was challenging the very foundations of what society agreed had worth. He was exiled from Sinope and wandered, eventually arriving in Athens with nothing, but instead of trying to rebuild his reputation or start over quietly, he doubled down on his defiance. He took the defacing of coins, symbols of false value, and turned it into a lifelong mission, to deface every false value he saw in the world. In Athens, Diogenes became a student of Antisthenes, but not in the classroom sense. Antisthenes didn't want disciples, and when Diogenes tried to learn from him, Antisthenes beat him with a stick to drive him away. Diogenes didn't flinch. "Strike," he said, "for you will find no wood hard enough to keep me from you." That persistence earned him a place beside Antisthenes, and eventually Diogenes took his teacher's ideas further than anyone expected. While Antisthenes talked about living a virtuous life with minimal needs, Diogenes lived it, relentlessly, shamelessly, even offensively. He owned almost nothing. He slept in a large ceramic jar, sometimes called a barrel, on the street. He begged for food and drank from streams. He wore the same cloak every day, summer or winter. He made no effort to appear respectable. In fact, he did the opposite. He made a point of violating social norms in public, eating in the marketplace, urinating outside, even masturbating in public when he felt the urge. When people criticized him for acting like a dog, he didn't deny it, he embraced it. "Other dogs bite their enemies," he said. "I bite my friends to save them." He was called kynikos, dog-like, which is where the word cynic comes from. But don't mistake him for a lunatic or a clown. Diogenes wasn't just being outrageous for the sake of it. His actions were pointed. He believed that most people live in chains they can't see, bound by customs, expectations, social roles, and the never-ending desire for more. So he tried to shock people into seeing their own prison walls. When he defecated in public, he wasn't being crude. He was asking, why is this act, which is natural and necessary, considered shameful, while deceit and greed are not? When he begged for food, he wasn't being lazy. He was demonstrating that survival doesn't require wealth, and that our supposed needs are often luxuries dressed as necessities. He mocked the rich not out of jealousy, but to expose their fear and dependency on things he had already learned to live without. Diogenes would approach well-dressed men and ask them for money, not because he expected them to give it, but to remind them how little they owned of themselves. He would walk into Plato's academy, the most respected school of philosophy, and interrupt lectures. Once, after Plato defined a human as a featherless biped, Diogenes plucked a chicken and brought it to the academy, announcing, "Here is Plato's man." Plato eventually referred to Diogenes as Socrates gone mad, but Diogenes was neither mad nor ignorant. He was dangerous in the way only someone with nothing to lose can be, and his life wasn't aimless rebellion. It was a test of what really matters. His rejection of society was deliberate. It wasn't about avoiding pain or escaping discomfort. It was about choosing the right kind of discomfort. He voluntarily embraced what others feared: hunger, poverty, humiliation, loneliness, because in doing so, he became invincible to them. What could you threaten him with? He had no property to seize, no reputation to destroy, no fear of judgment. He had stripped himself down to the essentials, and in doing so, found a kind of strength that most of us can't even imagine. Diogenes didn't ask people to imitate his life literally. You don't have to live in a barrel to be free, but he did believe that everyone should question what they've been taught to value. He challenged people to examine their cravings, their comforts, their routines. To him, the only real wealth was self-sufficiency, the only real virtue was honesty, and the only real life was one lived according to nature, not social conventions. He didn't believe in theory without practice. He was the kind of philosopher who didn't need to write books because he was the book. His life was the philosophy. And this is the key to understanding Diogenes. He wasn't rebelling for the sake of it. He was rebelling to reveal something deeper, something true. Every insult, every crude act, every defiance was aimed at waking people up. He wanted them to feel the absurdity of their own behavior, to see that they were living like prisoners in golden cages, cages they built themselves. Diogenes wasn't just against society. He was for something better, a life of raw, unscripted freedom, a life of truth, no matter how uncomfortable. And the only way to reach it was to strip everything false away. That's why he matters, not just as a historical oddity, but as a mirror. Because when you look at Diogenes, you're forced to ask, what part of my life is built on illusion? What am I holding on to that I don't really need? What false values have I accepted just to fit in? That's the beginning of the Cynic path, not destruction but excavation, not nihilism but truth. And Diogenes was willing to lose everything in order to find it. To understand cynicism, you have to let go of the modern meaning of the word. Today, when someone says he's such a cynic, they usually mean someone who distrusts everything, rolls their eyes at hope, and believes people are selfish or fake. But that's not what philosophical cynicism means, not even close. The original cynics were not bitter or hopeless. They were radically committed to truth, and they believed that to live well, you didn't need more advice, more things, or more theories. You needed to return to something ancient, something simple. You needed to return to nature. The word cynic comes from the Greek word kynikos, which means dog-like. It was meant as an insult, but Diogenes and his followers embraced it. To them, being like a dog meant living simply, instinctively, and without shame. Dogs don't wear masks. Dogs don't pretend to be what they're not. They eat when they're hungry. They bark when they're threatened. They sleep when they're tired. They don't play social games or chase status. They live naturally. And that's exactly what the cynics aim to do. Not in some primitive or animalistic way, but in a philosophical one. To be a cynic was to reject everything that pulled you away from your true nature. Everything that complicated life. Everything that made you less free. The first and most important principle of cynicism is this: live according to nature. That doesn't mean hugging trees or going camping, though they probably wouldn't mind that. It means living in a way that is aligned with who and what you are, at the core. A human being needs very little to survive: food, shelter, basic health, and a sense of connection. Everything else, expensive clothes, social media validation, career prestige, is extra. And the problem is, the more extras we accumulate, the more we depend on them, the more complicated our lives become. Cynics believe that by stripping all that away, by subtracting the false and artificial, you could return to what's real, and that's where freedom begins. The second core idea is the rejection of materialism and social status. Diogenes didn't just live in poverty because he had no choice, he chose it. He believed that needing nothing was the ultimate form of wealth. The fewer things you require to be happy, the harder it is for the world to control you. If you need a certain job, or a certain income, or a certain number of followers to feel worthy, then your peace is always at risk. But if you can be content with very little, then you're untouchable. You don't have to impress anyone. You don't have to win the game, because you're not even playing it. Diogenes often said, "He has the most who is content with the least." And in a world that constantly pressures us to upgrade our lives, that kind of contentment is revolutionary. Third, cynicism is built on radical honesty, not just being honest with others, but with yourself. That means facing the hard truths you usually avoid, the ones you cover up with distractions or excuses. The cynic doesn't pretend. He doesn't wear a mask to please others. He doesn't lie to protect his ego. If he's weak, he admits it. If he's afraid, he owns it. If he doesn't know something, he says so. In a world obsessed with image and performance, this kind of honesty is rare and powerful. Diogenes didn't just preach this honesty, he lived it. That's why he did things in public that others were ashamed of. Not to shock, but to ask, "Why are you hiding? Who taught you to be ashamed of being human?" Another essential part of Cynic philosophy is the practice of stripping away everything unnecessary. This isn't minimalism as a lifestyle trend. It's deeper than that. The Cynics believed that virtue, meaning strength of character, inner peace and wisdom, wasn't something you had to acquire. It was already inside you, but it was buried under layers of conditioning, desire, fear, and distraction. So their task wasn't to learn more or gain more, it was to unlearn, to simplify, to peel back all the layers and find what's essential. Think of it like sculpting. You don't add clay to make the statue, you remove it. You chip away until what remains is the truth. Now, some people confuse cynicism with stoicism, and it's true, they're closely related. Stoicism came later and built on some of the same ideas: self-sufficiency, control over desires, indifference to external opinions. But Stoicism is the polished, socially acceptable sibling. It's the clean-cut version you can practice in a business suit. Cynicism is the wild older brother who lives off the grid and couldn't care less what you think. Where Stoicism says bear hardship with dignity, cynicism says why suffer under rules that aren't real. Where Stoicism values self-control and inner strength, cynicism takes it further, into open rebellion against anything false or artificial. Both aim at freedom, but cynicism does it through confrontation and detachment from all social conditioning. The cynic is not a theorist. He doesn't sit around talking about virtue, he lives it. Diogenes once said, "A rich man is not one who has much, but one who needs little." He didn't publish books or give lectures. He demonstrated philosophy. Every act of his life was a critique of society and a lesson in freedom. When people asked him what he believed, he didn't respond with long speeches. He showed them with how he lived, what he rejected, what he endured. Cynicism, in this way, is a practice. It's not about believing in an idea, it's about removing what stops you from living it. And this is what makes cynicism so relevant today. Because we live in a time of massive complexity, constant distraction, endless consumption, social masks, and performance anxiety. We're told that to improve our lives we need to buy more, know more, do more. But the cynic whispers something different. You already have enough. You already are enough. But you've buried yourself under noise. And until you subtract that noise, until you unlearn what's false, you won't find peace. So no, cynicism isn't negativity. It's raw, direct, untamed truth. It's a path of radical simplification, not to escape life, but to live it more honestly. It doesn't offer comfort, it doesn't promise happiness in the traditional sense, but it offers something deeper, integrity. The feeling of standing on solid ground, knowing that you're not pretending, not performing. You're just living as nature intended, nothing more, nothing less. That's the cynic's way. Cynicism isn't about being bitter or pessimistic. It's about cutting through the lies, yours and everyone else's. It's about subtraction, not addition, not building a new identity, but shedding the false ones. Not becoming someone else, but returning to who you've always been once you've stopped pretending. Diogenes didn't believe in debating society, he believed in confronting it, and he did so not with theories or essays, but with actions so bold, shameless, and absurd that they forced people to confront their own values. He wasn't trying to win arguments, he was trying to hold up a mirror. His life became a kind of living satire, a performance art of raw philosophy, where every act was a punchline aimed at exposing the lies that held people captive. His target was always the same: hypocrisy. The way people claimed to value virtue, honesty, simplicity, but lived the opposite. So Diogenes played the fool to reveal who the real fools were. One of the most famous stories, almost mythic in its simplicity, involves Diogenes and Alexander the Great. At the time, Alexander was the most powerful man alive. He had conquered half the known world. He had armies, riches, palaces. And he'd heard of this strange philosopher who lived in a barrel and feared no one. Curious, Alexander sought him out. He found Diogenes sunbathing in the street, lying back with zero interest in royalty or military fame. Alexander approached and said something grand. "I am Alexander the Great." Diogenes looked up unfazed and replied, "And I am Diogenes the Cynic." Amused, Alexander offered him anything he desired, expecting perhaps praise or a request for favor. But Diogenes simply said, "Yes, there is something. Stand out of my sunlight." That single line is more than a witty comeback. It's a philosophical nuke. Alexander stood for empire, ambition, and the idea that greatness comes from domination and achievement. Diogenes, by needing nothing, by asking for nothing but to be left alone, flipped the entire logic of power on its head. In that moment, the man with armies was powerless, and the man with nothing, lying half naked in the street, was freer than any king. Another target of Diogenes' philosophical roast was Plato. After Socrates died, Plato tried to formalize his teacher's ideas into a system. He opened the academy, structured virtue into categories, and pursued ideal forms. Diogenes thought this was pretentious nonsense. When Plato defined man as a featherless biped, Diogenes didn't write a rebuttal. He plucked a chicken and marched into the academy declaring, "Behold, Plato's man." Plato later added with broad, flat nails to the definition, but the point had already landed. Diogenes believed that overthinking led people away from reality. He wasn't impressed by intellectual games. He wanted action, truth, immediacy, but his critiques weren't always so poetic. Sometimes they were flat out disgusting, on purpose. Diogenes often ate in public, which was considered taboo in Athens. He urinated in public corners. He once defecated on the stage of a theater during a performance. He masturbated in the marketplace. He knew it shocked people. That was the point, to make them squirm, to make them ask, why does this offend me more than corruption, greed, or lies? Why is a natural bodily function considered shameful, but pretending to be someone you're not isn't? This was Diogenes' genius. He weaponized shamelessness, not for shock value, but as a tool to test the foundations of society's values. In a culture obsessed with manners, appearances, and hierarchies, he chose to be openly, defiantly animal. And in doing so, he asked a dangerous question. What parts of our behavior are actually meaningful, and what parts are just performance? Is shame something natural, or something we've been trained to feel? The most famous image of Diogenes may be the one of him walking around Athens with a lit lantern in broad daylight. People asked him what he was doing. He replied, "I am looking for an honest man." This wasn't a joke. It was a statement about the moral decay he saw around him. Everyone talked about justice and virtue, but most people, he believed, were motivated by selfishness, fear, and vanity. So he hunted for honesty, not in words, but in actions. And what he found over and over again was that people clung to roles and reputations, not to truth. Now fast forward to today. We don't live in ancient Athens, but the issues Diogenes attacked haven't gone away. If anything, they've evolved. In our time, society worships image even more obsessively. Social media is an endless performance stage where people curate identities, filter their flaws, and carefully present the life they want others to see. We live in an age of influencers, self-branding, and aesthetic perfection. Even authenticity has become a performance. In a world like this, Diogenes would be cancelled instantly. He would break every community guideline, he'd be demonetized, banned, reported. But that only proves his point. We fear disruption more than we fear dishonesty. We're more offended by rudeness than we are by systemic hypocrisy. Diogenes would see right through the influencer culture, the hustle culture, the self-help industry that promises empowerment while feeding on insecurity. He'd call it all out, bluntly, shamelessly, without apology. In fact, today's obsession with being on brand, staying likable, saying the right thing, avoiding offense, it's exactly the kind of soft slavery Diogenes lived to destroy. He wasn't interested in being liked. He didn't care about fitting in. He didn't even care about being remembered. He cared about freedom, the kind of freedom that comes when you stop caring about how you're perceived and start caring about whether or not you're living in truth. And this is where Diogenes becomes more than a provocateur. His actions may have been outrageous, but his motivation wasn't cruelty. It was compassion, in the rawest sense. He wanted people to wake up, to shake off the mental chains they didn't even know they were wearing. Every time he made someone uncomfortable, he was trying to pull them closer to reality, to peel back the layers of social programming and make them ask, why am I living this way? Who taught me to value this? What happens if I stop pretending? That's the art of the philosophical roast. Diogenes didn't insult people for fun. He exposed their contradictions. He held up a mirror and dared them to look. And while most people hated what they saw, a few got the message. Even Alexander the Great, after being roasted by Diogenes, supposedly said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes," because in his heart even the conqueror knew that man was truly free. Diogenes understood something most people spend their entire lives avoiding, that true freedom isn't found in accumulation, it's found in letting go. In a culture that tells us to measure our worth by what we have, our income, our wardrobe, our car, our watch, our subscriber count, Diogenes flipped the script. He didn't want more. He wanted less. Not because he hated pleasure or comfort, but because he saw clearly that the more you need, the easier it is for the world to control you. And so, he decided to live with almost nothing. One of the most telling stories from Diogenes' life is about a bowl. He carried one with him to drink water, just a simple tool, one of the few possessions he owned. But one day, he saw a boy cupping his hands to drink from a fountain. Without a second thought, Diogenes threw away his bowl. If a child could drink with nothing, so could he. That moment wasn't just about reducing clutter. It was a philosophical decision. Every item he removed from his life was one less dependency, one less thing he had to carry, one less thing that could be taken from him. The more he gave up, the freer he became. At the end of his decluttering, All Diogenes owned was a cloak to wear, a bag for food, and a staff to walk with. That was it. No home, no furniture, no bank account, no plan for retirement. And yet, he wasn't anxious. He was autonomous. While others locked their doors in fear of thieves, Diogenes slept peacefully in the open. While others worried about promotions or property values, Diogenes woke up with the sun and lived each day as it came. He didn't have stability, but he had independence. He didn't have comfort, but he had peace. Now try to imagine that today. Imagine if someone chose to live without a phone, without a home, without social media, without status or ambition. We wouldn't call them wise, we'd call them crazy. We've been taught to equate wealth with success, consumption with self-care, and luxury with happiness. Scroll through Instagram or TikTok, and you'll see influencers flaunting their private jets, their designer wardrobes, their morning routines that require $300 skincare products. These images are sold to us as the pinnacle of living your best life. But are they really? Diogenes would say no, not just no, he'd laugh. Because what looks like freedom to us often isn't freedom at all. It's just a prettier kind of slavery. The more things you need to feel okay, the more fragile your peace becomes. If you need a high salary to feel secure, then your employer owns your peace. If you need a perfect body to feel lovable, then your mirror owns your self-worth. If you need constant stimulation to avoid boredom, then your phone owns your attention. That's not power, that's dependency in disguise. Diogenes' philosophy was simple. Own less and you'll fear less. Need less and you'll suffer less. By shedding possessions and desires, you become untouchable. You're no longer at the mercy of fortune, trends, or public opinion. When someone threatened him, he could shrug it off. What could they possibly take from him? He had already given up everything except what was truly his mind, his values, and his time. That's a kind of wealth few people today can imagine. This doesn't mean everyone should throw away their possessions and live in a barrel. Cynicism, at its core, isn't about poverty. It's about freedom from craving. It's not about refusing all comfort, but about not being ruled by it. There's nothing wrong with owning things. What matters is whether those things own you. Diogenes didn't just give up stuff. He gave up the fear of not having stuff. That's the real point. You can have a home, a job, a phone, but can you let go of them if you had to? Could you walk away and still feel whole? Our modern economy is built on convincing you that you're not enough. Every advertisement whispers that you're missing something. A better body, a better phone, a better life. And the solution is always to buy your way to fulfillment. But fulfillment doesn't come from more. It comes from less, from needing less, from simplifying your life until what's left is actually yours, not something you rented from the marketplace of trends and validation. There's a quote often misattributed but deeply aligned with Cynic thinking: wealth is not having great possessions but having few wants. Diogenes lived that truth to the extreme. He trained himself to want almost nothing, not because he was miserable, but because he had discovered the joy of self-sufficiency. Imagine waking up and not needing to check your bank account, not needing to impress anyone, not needing to prove anything, just existing, simply, honestly, and fully. That's the Cynic's version of wealth. He challenged the very definition of what it means to be rich. In one story, a group of wealthy men mocked Diogenes, saying, "If you would learn to flatter, you wouldn't have to beg." Diogenes shot back, "And if you would learn to beg, you wouldn't have to flatter." That was his power. He wasn't dependent on praise, approval, or money. He had nothing, but he lacked nothing, because his needs were aligned with nature, not with culture. And this raises an uncomfortable question for all of us. How much of what we chase is really necessary? How much of what we think we need is just conditioning? Could we be happy with less? Not because we're settling, but because we're finally free of the pressure to keep up? Diogenes wasn't living in lack, he was living in abundance. Not material abundance, but inner abundance. He had time, he had clarity, He had nothing to hide and nothing to fear. There's something deeply refreshing about that. In a world of endless scrolling, endless consuming, endless striving, Diogenes is like a reset button. He reminds us that the goal of life is not to collect trophies, but to uncover what you are when everything else is stripped away. You don't need more, you need less, but better. Less noise, less craving, less pretending, more truth, more peace, more freedom. The less you need, the more free you are. That's the cynic's version of success. Not how much you have, but how little you need to be at peace. Diogenes owned nothing, but he walked through the world untouchable, unbothered, and fully himself. And maybe that's the kind of wealth we should all be chasing. Diogenes didn't just reject wealth or status, he rejected something far more powerful: the need to be liked, the need to be accepted, the fear of being judged. He didn't just step outside the norms of society, he burned them down, lit the match himself, and then laughed while everyone stared. Because for Diogenes, true freedom wasn't just owning less or needing nothing, it was becoming immune to other people's opinions. Shame, he believed, was a weapon used by society to keep people small, obedient, and quiet. And if you wanted to be free, you had to kill the part of yourself that cared what others thought. That's why Diogenes did things we consider outrageous. He didn't do them for shock value, he did them to destroy the illusion of shame. He bathed in freezing rivers, even when others mocked him. He begged for food in daylight, something only the lowest of the low did in Athens. He urinated in public. He even masturbated in the street, something that still horrifies people to this day. But to him, these weren't acts of rebellion, they were acts of liberation. He wanted to prove that the source of your suffering isn't the act itself, but your fear of what others will think. You're not bound by nature, you're bound by opinion. And the only way to break the chain is to walk straight into judgment and feel it lose its power. In today's language, what Diogenes practiced would be called exposure therapy, a method used in modern psychology to treat phobias, anxiety, and PTSD. The idea is simple. Instead of avoiding what you fear, you slowly, repeatedly expose yourself to it. And over time, your brain stops seeing it as dangerous. The fear shrinks, the shame dissolves. For example, someone terrified of public speaking might practice by giving short speeches in front of a mirror, then to a friend, then to a group. Bit by bit, they desensitized themselves to the fear. Diogenes took this concept to its extreme. He made himself so familiar with judgment, rejection, and ridicule that it no longer touched him. He wasn't just tolerating criticism, he was immune to it. And here's the thing, he wasn't born that way. No one is. He trained himself to be shameless. He walked through discomfort over and over again until it became irrelevant. And that's the lesson for us. Because let's be honest, our lives today are shaped by fear of judgment in ways we don't even notice. Social media has made it worse. Every post, every photo, every comment, we're constantly scanning for approval. Did I get enough likes? Did I say something dumb? Am I being ignored? We curate our personalities like brands. We post what we think people want to see. We hide our weirdness. We edit our flaws. And somewhere along the way, we forget how to be real. Perfectionism feeds on this fear. So does people-pleasing. We want to say no, but we don't. We want to speak up, but we shrink. We want to rest, but we keep grinding so no one thinks we're lazy. So much of what we do isn't driven by desire, it's driven by avoidance. Avoiding disapproval, avoiding embarrassment, avoiding rejection. But Diogenes shows us another way. He teaches us that ridicule loses its teeth the moment you stop caring. That shame only has power if you give it power. Think about it like this. What if you wore your weirdness out in the open? What if you shared your real thoughts even when they weren't popular? What if you let people misunderstand you and didn't rush to explain? What if you stopped editing yourself? Diogenes didn't just live like no one's watching. He lived like everyone was watching and still didn't care. That's the kind of inner strength we need today. Not the strength to be liked, but the strength to be disliked without flinching. Now, obviously, you don't need to do what Diogenes did. You don't have to beg in the street or take cold baths or defy every social norm, but you can start noticing where shame shows up in your life. When you silence yourself in a conversation, what are you afraid of? When you put off starting something because you feel unqualified, who are you worried will laugh? When you apologize for taking up space, whose imaginary judgment are you reacting to? Trace those fears back, and you'll find a belief. I'm not allowed to be seen unless I'm perfect. Diogenes shattered that belief, and you can too. Start small. Say what you really think in a conversation, even if it makes you nervous. Wear something you like, even if it's not trendy. Share an opinion online without softening it to be more palatable. Let yourself be visible in your full, imperfect humanness. And when that fear kicks in, that tightening in your chest, that voice saying they're going to think you're stupid, remind yourself of Diogenes, the man who pissed in public and told the most powerful king in the world to move out of the way. The man who was freer in his ragged cloak than most people are in designer suits. The man who taught us that the moment you stop fearing shame, you start living. This is what cynicism offers. Not just a minimalist lifestyle, but a psychological revolution. You don't need to change who you are. You need to stop hiding who you are. You need to be willing to be seen, even if it means being misunderstood. You need to value truth more than approval. That's what Diogenes did every day of his life. And he died not as a martyr, but as a man who was never owned by anyone, not by fear, not by reputation, not by the system. To live freely, you must become indifferent to ridicule, not immune in the sense that you never feel it, but strong enough that it doesn't guide your actions. The real cage isn't judgment, it's the fear of judgment. Break that, and you can finally walk through the world unchained, like a dog in the sun, like Diogenes, untouched by shame, unapologetically alive. Living like Diogenes today doesn't mean throwing away your phone, quitting your job, or moving into a barrel. The modern world isn't ancient Athens, and most of us aren't interested in becoming barefoot street philosophers. But the spirit of cynicism, the raw, liberating power of needing less and fearing nothing, is more relevant now than ever. We live in a culture of compulsive consumption, curated perfection, and dopamine-driven distraction. Everything tells us to chase more comfort, more approval, more stuff. Being a modern cynic doesn't mean rejecting the world. It means rejecting the lies it sells you. It's a way of seeing through the noise and saying, I don't need this to be free. It starts with a mental shift. You begin to question your desires instead of automatically pursuing them. Cynicism teaches you to ask, why do I want this? Before you chase anything. Is it because it genuinely brings you peace or because it makes you look good? Are you pursuing a goal because it matters to your values or because it'll earn you praise? This is where the cynic journey begins, not with changing your habits, but with changing your thinking. Because if your desires are borrowed from advertising, culture, or your social circle, then your life isn't yours. And freedom begins the moment you start untangling which of your wants are truly yours and which were programmed into you. Once that mindset is in place, you can begin to experiment. You don't need to overhaul your life all at once. In fact, The best way to embody cynicism today is to test it, one act at a time. Try small practices that push you out of your comfort zone and loosen your attachment to things that don't really matter. Start with something simple. Go one full day without buying anything. No coffee, no online shopping, no food delivery, no transactions of any kind. Just observe how quickly the impulse to consume shows up and how uncomfortable it feels to say no to it. That discomfort is your edge. That's where growth begins. Another practice is the digital detox. Spend a full day or even just a few hours without your phone, laptop, or TV. No scrolling, no notifications, no digital background noise. You'll notice how much of your attention is usually outsourced to screens, how quick we are to distract ourselves from silence, from stillness, from boredom. Diogenes didn't fear boredom, he embraced it. He sat in the sun and watched people. He walked aimlessly. He talked to strangers. He was present with life in its rawest form. A modern cynic learns to do the same, not by rejecting technology completely, but by reclaiming control over their attention. Another way to build your cynic muscles is through cold exposure, literally. Take cold showers, walk in the rain without an umbrella, sit outside in winter for a few minutes without a jacket. These aren't just physical challenges, they're mental ones. They teach you to be okay with discomfort, to not panic the moment conditions aren't ideal. Comfort has become a drug in the modern world. Heating, air conditioning, Uber Eats, instant delivery, algorithmic entertainment, everything is designed to remove friction. But Diogenes would argue, you grow through friction. You learn what you're made of when life isn't perfectly controlled. One of the most powerful cynic practices is exposing yourself to harmless embarrassment. This can be anything from wearing mismatched clothes in public to singing loudly in a park to dancing badly in front of strangers. The goal is not to become an attention seeker. It's to break your addiction to approval. We spend so much energy managing how we're perceived, sculpting a version of ourselves that feels safe, acceptable, and likable. But Diogenes believed that the fear of looking foolish was one of the deepest prisons. So he intentionally did things that made others cringe, not because he enjoyed it, but because he didn't care. And that's the goal. To teach yourself that you can survive disapproval, that ridicule doesn't kill you, that being imperfect in public is not a moral failure. You might never live in a barrel, but you can find your version of it. The barrel in the modern world is any lifestyle that lets you live simply and freely without needing constant validation. Maybe that means living below your means, choosing a small apartment when you could afford something bigger. Maybe it means deleting your social media for a year and seeing what happens. Maybe it means quitting the job that pays well but costs your soul. The barrel is a symbol. It represents choosing your peace over other people's expectations. And in a culture obsessed with appearances, that's a radical choice. Another powerful skill of the modern cynic is learning to say no without apologizing. No to invitations that drain you. No to work that goes against your values. No to social obligations that feel fake. Diogenes didn't ask for permission to live on his terms, and neither should you. Most of us say yes out of guilt, habit, or fear of missing out, but every yes that goes against your truth is a form of self-betrayal. The cynic isn't rude, they're clear, they draw boundaries and stick to them. They don't explain themselves unless they choose to. They live from the inside out, not the outside in. The beauty of all these practices is that they aren't about self-denial, they're about self-ownership. Each time you resist a false desire, you reclaim a little more of your time, energy, and identity. Each time you choose discomfort over conformity, you remember that your power doesn't come from being liked, it comes from being honest. Diogenes wasn't trying to be a martyr, he was just trying to live in alignment with what he believed. And when you start doing that, even in small ways, you feel it, the quiet joy of not needing to pretend anymore. The calm that comes from knowing you aren't chained to a lifestyle you didn't choose. You don't need to live in a barrel, but you do need to question your comforts. Cynicism is not about giving up everything, it's about giving up the need for everything. That's where real peace begins. Not in controlling your environment, but in mastering your response to it, in learning to say, I am enough without the extras, in training yourself to be free even if the world never approves. And the best part, you don't need anyone's permission to start. Cynicism, as Diogenes lived it, is undeniably powerful, but it's not without its flaws. When we strip a philosophy down to its essence and hold it up as an ideal, it's easy to forget that even the most radical truths can cast long shadows. For all the clarity cynicism offers, there are limits to rejecting everything, and if we don't examine those limits, we risk turning a path of liberation into a trap of extremism. This isn't about dismissing Diogenes. It's about engaging with his philosophy honestly, including the parts that don't sit so easily with modern life. Let's start with the problem of extremism. Cynicism, by design, is radical. It doesn't ask for minor changes. It demands a total stripping away of societal norms, comforts, and attachments. That's what makes it so potent, but also so dangerous. When you reject everything, possessions, status, ambition, shame, social roles, what are you left with? For Diogenes, the answer was a kind of raw, natural freedom, but for others, especially today, it can quickly slide into nihilism. If nothing matters, if every institution is corrupt, if every norm is fake, if all desire is bondage, what's the point? Unlike Stoicism or Buddhism, which also teach detachment but within a framework of meaning and purpose, cynicism often stops at the destruction phase. It tears down illusions, but offers little guidance for what to build in their place. That can leave followers adrift, hollowed out by rebellion but unsure where to go next. Then there's the issue of social withdrawal. Diogenes opted out of the world. He didn't try to fix society, he left it behind, physically and mentally. That was his answer to hypocrisy. Walk away. But what if you don't want to walk away? What if you want to stay in the world, have a family, run a business, be part of a community, and still live authentically? Cynicism doesn't offer much help there. It's a solitary path. It's built for the outsider, not the builder. Critics point out that total disengagement is a luxury not everyone can afford. Some people don't have the option to live with nothing, to reject the system. They have responsibilities, they have children to raise, people to care for, communities to support, and even if you can opt out, does that solve anything? Cynicism can free the individual, yes, but does it improve the world for anyone else? Rejecting the system is easier than changing it, but is that enough? There's also a more subtle danger in cynicism, the temptation of self-righteousness. For some people, rejecting social norms isn't about truth, it's about feeling superior. It becomes a performance. You stop caring not because you've let go, but because you want to appear untouchable. You start roasting people not to reveal truth, but to elevate yourself above them. This isn't real cynicism, it's ego in a different costume. Diogenes was harsh, but he had integrity. He lived his philosophy every minute of every day. But modern imitators might just be trying to be edgy, using honesty as a weapon instead of a tool. And when that happens, what was once a path to freedom becomes just another role to play, another illusion to uphold. Another criticism worth taking seriously is that cynicism, at least in its ancient form, can lack compassion. Diogenes was blunt, confrontational, even rude. He believed in truth at all costs. But modern life isn't lived in isolation. We're wired for connection. We work in teams, we build relationships, we support one another emotionally. There's a balance to be struck between honesty and empathy, between directness and sensitivity. Critics argue that cynicism overcorrects. It throws away the masks, but sometimes forgets the value of warmth, patience, and understanding. There's a difference between not needing approval and not caring about people. Telling the truth matters, but how you tell it matters too. If your honesty alienates everyone around you, you may win the argument but lose the connection. And in today's world, connection is often where the deepest growth happens. Finally, there's the practicality issue. Let's be honest, most people aren't going to live in a barrel. Most people can't live with nothing. And even if they could, would it make their lives better? Diogenes lived in poverty, but he chose it. For him, it was a weapon against the false values of society. But for many, poverty isn't a choice, it's a trap. Cynicism can sometimes romanticize suffering, as if discomfort alone is virtuous. But suffering isn't automatically noble. Sometimes it's just suffering. And while there's great power in learning to need less, there's also wisdom in building a stable life. The challenge is to apply cynicism selectively, to use its insights without burning your life to the ground, to take the principle, but not the extremism. You don't need to renounce everything. You just need to stop letting everything own you. That's where the metaphor of the barrel becomes useful. You don't need to live in a literal barrel. Your barrel might be your small apartment, your quiet refusal to join social media, your decision to take a lower-paying job that gives you peace. It might be as simple as not dressing to impress or saying no when everyone expects you to say yes. The point isn't to become Diogenes. The point is to remember what he stood for: freedom, truth, and self-sufficiency, and to find a way to live those values within the life you've chosen, not outside it. Cynicism is not a perfect system. It's not even really a system. It's more like a fire. It burns through lies, illusions, and vanity. But fire alone doesn't build a home. It clears the space. What you build in that space is up to you. That's where other philosophies, other disciplines, and your own inner wisdom come in. You don't have to choose between living like Diogenes and living in society. You can choose a third path, one where you engage with the world but refuse to be consumed by it. Cynicism is not an aesthetic. It's not a brand of minimalism or some edgy trend to post about on Instagram. It's a challenge, a radical confrontation with everything false. Diogenes didn't live in a barrel because he wanted attention. He lived there because he refused to lie. He refused to pretend that he needed what everyone else said he needed. He didn't want a better job or a better outfit or a better reputation. He wanted truth, and he was willing to lose everything else to find it. This is the core of cynicism, not the rejection of life, but the rejection of illusion, not about adding more, but stripping away what isn't real. You don't need to be richer, smarter, prettier, or more successful to live a good life. You just need to stop chasing what doesn't belong to you. The cynic doesn't offer a roadmap to success. He offers a shovel. He hands it to you and says, "Dig, remove everything that isn't you." You were born free. Then you signed up for a prison of comfort and conformity. That's the truth most people avoid. We become so wrapped up in our routines, our roles, our reputations, that we forget we weren't always like this. We weren't always afraid to speak our minds. We weren't always hungry for approval. Somewhere along the line, we traded authenticity for acceptance, truth for convenience, freedom for fitting in. Diogenes didn't make that trade, and neither do you have to. So here's the challenge. Right now, ask yourself, what's one thing I can discard today? Not something trivial, something real, a toxic habit, a fake persona, a need to impress, a desire you've been clinging to that isn't truly yours. One piece of mental or emotional clutter that's keeping you from living clearly. Just one. Start there, and don't look back. Because freedom doesn't come from having more. It comes from needing less. Peace doesn't come from being liked. It comes from being honest. The world will always try to dress you up, weigh you down, make you small. But you get to choose. You can walk away from the noise. You can let go of the lies. You can live like Diogenes, not in his barrel, but in his spirit. So choose truth over comfort. Choose less over more. Choose freedom over fitting in. And remember the words of the man who lived with nothing and feared no one. It is the privilege of the gods to want nothing and of godlike men to want little. Start now. Subtract what isn't you. See what's left. That is the beginning of a life that's truly yours.